Value Impulses, the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A very warm welcome, dear listeners, to today's episode of our podcast for potential development. Value Impulses is our main title, and today I have invited a very, very wonderful guest. I am very pleased that Bertram Kasper is here with us today for an interview. A very warm welcome to you, dear Bertram.
Yes, hello Uli. I'm happy that I can be here.
Great. And we're going to dive right into it. My team is always so kind and puts together a sort of short profile for me about my guests. And I always chuckle a bit because, as a rule, I know my guests quite well. And I know what they've been up to, where they come from, and what they do. But sometimes there's something new in there because my team also does very, very good research. And they've titled the profile, Bertram, as a multi-talent. So we have podcaster, blogger, author, speaker, aging strategist. We'll talk more about that, and also visionary. And yes, this vision, I'll mention it now, is a pro-aging culture, which we'll talk a bit more about today. But first, perhaps some background on your career so our listeners can get to know you. You were with the St. Elisabeth Association for over 36 years. That's really like a lifelong commitment, so to speak, which you don't see so often these days. You're also a certified supervisor, business coach, crisis coach, and so on. You also founded GISA in the context of supervision. You're also on the board of the Foster Children Support Association. You've been doing a lot of things as a freelancer for a long time. Leadership development, potential analysis, organizational design. So, I could just keep going on like this. And as for our story, we met through Tamara Dietl. That was quite a while ago now. You also went through the training at Profiling Values many years ago. You're also a master. You were in Frankfurt and Munich. We have a long-standing partnership in our collaboration, and I'm very happy that you're with us today. And what always interests me, Bertram, is the why or the whys in the lives of my guests, of people in general. I'm very interested in people. And so, of course, the first question for you, as you introduce yourself briefly and tell us a bit more. What was the first why in terms of your career choice that you went into? Social work. I'm interested in that. Bertram, go ahead.
Yes, with pleasure. Well, I recently gave my farewell speech. At the St. Elisabeth Association, and in that context, I gave this exact question some more thought. And it's actually like this. My father, he was a social worker, my mother a pediatric nurse, and they tried to teach us kids how one can find meaning in life. And this ability, they basically tried to, teach us, to bring it home to us over and over again. And we realized, we children, that the topic of self-efficacy is a very important and central one. So, how do I use the skills and talents I have to basically have an impact on the person I'm interacting with? And I was able to have this experience basically every day at the SOS Children's Village, where I grew up with my family. Through my father's work. And then it became clear relatively quickly that I also wanted to work with people. And starting from my professional background, first with children and youth, and then later on with adults as well. And this aspect of developing people, of accompanying people, basically there. Expanding their spaces of possibility, as I'd like to call it. That is a very central why. And that doesn't just apply to the people I interact with, so to speak, but it also applies to myself. And so, a motto of mine is, being effective through relationships. And there's a lot of why in that.
Totally. That's also a very important contribution to a successful life, to put it that way. And we just can't do that alone, but I often have this saying in my head. I don't know who said it. We only come to the I through the you. So we need each other, like you said, the relationships. And if you can contribute to others, I think the term expanding spaces of possibility is great. I always say recognizing potentials. And unfolding them so that they get as much as possible out of themselves, then it also gives me. And I think you too, a kind of inner satisfaction in the sense of, yes, that's also a nice contribution to my own successful life.
Exactly. So, that's exactly how you can summarize it. People need people.
Yes, exactly. And that was practically clear from, well, Mother's Milk or from the SOS Children's Village. I didn't know that at all. Then you also started your studies there, so to speak, and then the St. Elizabeth Association. That's already something quite big. You also told me recently, with all the leadership roles you had there, at the peak you were responsible for 600 people and so on. What was your why there, specifically for going into that? And then to actually go down that path?
I basically grew up from the ground up in the St. Elizabeth Association, you could say. So the first stage was that I moved into a single-family home as a live-in educator, where I had a small separate apartment and where I basically lived together with 6 children. And there was also an educator and a community service worker. And this task was, of course, to give the children a new home because the parents, as we call it in our professional jargon, were unable to raise them. And yes, and from that, of course, a lot of the why and what for arises, namely to support and accompany the life biographies of children who are impaired due to their own history. And I'm also very interested in this topic of tracks and leaving tracks behind. And the exciting thing is when you meet these children years later, or by then they were young adults, when we met them, for example, we went out to eat regularly with some of these children for many years. Then they told us what kind of impact, so to speak, was triggered in them by what we did. And the exciting thing was, it was sometimes completely different things than what we thought. So the children's focus wasn't always the focus that we had. And they took out, so to speak, what was helpful for them. And in this story, it already becomes clear how much meaning, so to speak, lies in giving people a space to try themselves out, to develop themselves, and basically to heal a bit, as I like to call it.
Wow, so that also means that it was very fulfilling, so to speak, in retrospect, when you meet the people again. And then you see what the fruits of the work actually are.
Exactly.
And then you went into leadership, of course. I mean, for me professionally, that's always a big step, saying, okay, I'm now taking on responsibility for others, for entire areas. Responsibility. And yet, but that's how I got to know you, you've always stayed very close to people and worked. You actually started with supervision right from the beginning. And what was this thread? When you look at it in your professional life, the why, and what did you take away from it?
Exactly, so. Then it was like this, that at some point I basically went into work with foster families. That means I was a consultant for foster families for many years after I was a live-in educator there. And that's when I basically started supporting adults. At the same time, I studied supervision and there I tried, so to speak, by accompanying and advising the adults to basically enable better living spaces for foster children in these families. And there's naturally a strong purpose behind it, though the focus there is on adults. And then there was a transition, basically, to the founding of GISA, the St. Elizabeth Innovative Social Work Limited, Society for Innovative Social Work, you could say. That we founded it because we said we don't just want to have an external impact, but an internal one too. That means we thought about it when we founded it, which I did with my board at the time, Rudiger Rodi. That we wanted an internal personnel development tool so educators could move into training, following the motto, from practice for practice, and thus build up a secondary branch alongside their main activity, so to speak. That was the idea. And we naturally wanted to take what we'd learned over the years, since the Elizabeth Association was constantly growing and expanding, with more service areas, and we felt capable of advising other organizations, youth welfare offices, or elderly care facilities. Exactly. And I did that for many years and then quite deliberately went back. From consulting, if you will, or support in personnel development, into management, and then became the managing director of this educational institution, which also had a youth welfare branch. And then I took over the largest residential area of the St. Elizabeth Association. And that's how it came to those 600 employees. And what really, how should I put it, drove me in a positive sense, there's so much passion in that word for me, was that it was always about giving employees as much room for opportunity as possible so that they succeed in being responsible for their respective fields of work, so to speak. And of course, when that works out, it's absolutely fantastic. And people become more independent in what they do, while management stays more in the background, so to speak. Having a role or stepping in during certain crises. Of course, but otherwise making itself relatively dispensable.
Yes, that's also my third main task, which I always give as a credo. For managers, start making yourself redundant. Naturally, being there in the background when things get dicey, just as you said. I remember 2 of your employees well, who were led and guided by you at GISA and, well, they developed wonderfully. Like Julia Wadowitz and also Marie Haberland. And I found it truly impressive how you in the social sector, or this 3-person team, handled this consulting branch, first internally and then externally. Many companies try that, setting up internal service providers. And then they say, well, go look for external customers too. I've seen this business model fail many times. And you've succeeded very, very well with it. And you've managed to free yourself up through that. Through empowerment, I'd say, or how you let people grow or supported them in their growth, and you've always kept that foster parent aspect too. And I'd like to point out that this has also become a profiling values application. Maybe you could briefly outline how you came up with that. And yes, our listeners are familiar with profiling values, usually in its conventional use, recruitment, personnel development, leadership, team building, and so on. But tell us how it was in these specific cases.
Yes, it's truly something special, if I may say so, because it's a kind of unique selling point for the St. Elisabeth Association. And the foster families, because we said, I did the training with you in 2011, because we said, how do we ensure we integrate profiling values into the accreditation process for foster families? So, basically, families apply to us and they go through a 9-step accreditation process. And at first, we only used profiling values when questions arose that we couldn't resolve, so to speak. We realized that profiling values opens up a new perspective for us that we basically couldn't filter out. For example, what's always impressed me is how people evaluate things. Like, where is the value preference and how high is the variance among the different values, depending on the case. So, that was a very important aspect, for instance, and we grew so fond of the process that in 2014 we decided to make it a standard part of the accreditation process. That means, currently, every family that applies to us goes through a profiling. And the insights we gain from that are, as mentioned, quite different. One is, of course, the question of how a person evaluates things. But it's also the question of variance. It's the balance between the external and the internal, so to speak, which is totally important to us. And where we also get really fascinating insights. And I once wrote an article about this, which is that we basically get an idea. Let me give an example. If someone is strong on the human value level and has a preference there, then of course it's important for them, when he or she thinks about taking in a foster child, whether it fits on a human level, so do I gain access to the child and also to the child's background. And I always say, if someone has strong human values, it's totally important that they can connect with the child in a figurative sense. Exactly. And if someone is strong on a practical level, for example, that's often the case with foster fathers. So, women tend to be more developed on the human value level, and men tend to be more developed on this practical value level. And for them, the question is totally important: do I feel up to the difficulties that are coming my way? What we already know, so to speak, about the child or their background. Can I handle that? Can I find an answer to that? Can I step on the gas or can I hit the brakes? Am I balanced, so to speak, in stepping on the gas? That's a very important point. Because if I felt that, with this strong value orientation, I wouldn't be able to do it justice, so to speak. Then we'd rather say, stay away from it, and we'll look for another child instead. And those are the kinds of insights that we find out about in a special way, yeah. And I'm totally happy. I'm now basically in a transitional phase. And my two successors, they also recognize the value of the profiling. And we were able to get 2 more colleagues, or even 3 colleagues, to either deepen their training or even start fresh. And I'm totally happy about that.
Nice. Thank you very much, Bertram, for describing that so impressively. Right, you also mentioned, the outside and the inside of foster parents. And when we look at the value system with the process, we also look at how someone is positioned in self-leadership. And again, under the aspects of leading oneself as a person, being aware of one's social roles, so to speak, but also having a personal vision, a life plan, to be positioned in that way. And self-leadership is a basic requirement for any kind of leadership. But especially in the context of foster parents and foster children, I find it very, very exciting. But now I'd like to take a little break and jump ahead, Bertram, to when we spoke intensively about, half a year ago. That's when I first heard from you. And then I also listened in on your podcast, Aging with Serenity. And I think it's very, very good. And I'd like to talk with you a bit about the motives and also about the content at one point or another. On the internet, if you Google it, it says right away, Bertram Kasper's target group is 24-point-something million people in Germany. The Swiss and Austrians are probably not even included in that. That is, of course, gigantic. You already had another podcast experience before, or rather you still do, in the context of foster children, the topic we just had. But how did it come about that you focused on this? I think the title is brilliant too, Aging with Serenity.
MHM. Yes, that's an interesting story. And I take on my vacations, not every one, but when we're on vacation for about 2 weeks, I always take a question with me. That I can't always give enough space to in the hustle and bustle of everyday work life, so to speak. And in 2019, when I was on vacation in Porto, Portugal, with my wife Inga, I took the question with me, what do I want to do with the third phase of my life? I was 58 then, and that question basically stayed with me throughout that vacation. And then I realized that aging is actually something I don't find all that easy when I reflect on my own experience, so to speak. So that requires processes of adjustment. And I had my first major adjustment process back when I was 44 because I tore my meniscus and couldn't run marathons anymore. That meant I had to think of a different sport. That was, so to speak, the first, really serious, conscious physical setback where I thought, oh, now you're getting older, so to speak. And that, of course, continued from there. And I have quite a bit of respect for that, I must say. That was one of the starting points. The other starting point was that I felt aging is basically presented in 2 extremes in the public eye. So, either it's incredibly discriminated against, meaning ageism, and there's an incredible amount of literature on that. And on the other hand, aging is idealized because it's a large group that's also relatively healthier than the generation before us. That means we basically have the poles of discrimination and idealization. And I thought, I would like to portray aging, with all its facets, the easy ones and the difficult ones, so that a complex and nuanced picture of aging emerges, so to speak. That was one of the starting points. The other was that I had already done a podcast in 2010, an educational podcast. Back then, it wasn't as well known. And I know, I would have also liked to be a pastor, that I basically love to talk. And convey things to people. And I remembered that too, so to speak. And then I thought, the best way to do it is, I'll do a podcast on aging where I can learn something myself, so to speak, through the guests I invite. And also through engaging with the topic. And I'll let others participate in it, because I have something to convey, because I have good content. And that's basically how the idea for this podcast came about. And I'd like to add one more thing to that. I'm a real project person, always doing new things, starting something new, and constantly coming up with new ideas. And then I decided I wanted to take a different approach with this podcast. I wanted to first dive deep into the theory of getting older, so to speak. So I did a lot of reading. Then I found an expert who gave me advice on the subject of podcasting. Then I wrote a concept for the podcast and so on. Then I thought about who I wanted to invite. So that means I really took almost 3 years of preparation time until I finally launched it in January 2021. And I did that intentionally because I wanted to prepare something in depth for once, unlike how I usually do things.
MHM, yes. That actually brings us full circle to the beginning, right, where you say you want to grow from it yourself. Or learn something, find out more about getting older. But at the same time, also talk to others about it, especially experts. And yes, to have many listeners who can also benefit from it. Ultimately, those are relationships too. And yet you've approached the topic in such depth this time. Just like you said. And I've listened to a few episodes, but I've mainly looked at who you've invited and so on. I mean, it's really the creme de la creme of specialists in this field. So I can really only recommend to all the listeners to take a look. And the topics are also incredibly interesting and varied. I think it's great. We could talk about that for a long time. What interests me now is that we always have value impulses as our heading, and I wonder, in the context of potential development. Of course, but getting older is obviously something special.
Yes.
You mentioned the third stage of life and so on, but of course there will be values that are particularly important for your target group here. And you've been doing it for 3 years now and so on.
MHM.
What would you say they are? The most important values and trends, the themes that emerge, that could perhaps be condensed.
MHM. Well, first of all, it's important to say that age and getting older are very nuanced, very diverse, so there's no such thing as the typical elderly person. That was one of the first insights I gained. And in that sense, the values are naturally different too. But if I want to summarize things now, basically, to see what's emerging, then in old age, this aspect of human values, which we've already touched on, becomes extremely important.
MHM.
Because naturally, since when people have children and the children leave home, the married couple, or the couple, is sort of thrown back on themselves and they have to, so to speak, figure out how to shape their lives again. And another major turning point is when I retire. Well, I prefer to call it the phase of free activity. So when I basically no longer have the social network for my job, what's it like then with a social network? And that's why it's basically extremely important. And here we are again, back at the beginning. How do we as humans generate meaning? We generate meaning through other people. By, so to speak, relating to one another, by valuing each other, and by feeling like we belong. And these aspects are, of course, for old age as well, extremely important and significant. And it's no coincidence that the federal government has now launched a plan that deals with the issue of loneliness in general, but also specifically in old age. So I would say this level of human values, when we refer to profiling, is extremely important. Exactly. And the second point that I find really important is that as people get older, they become more composed, you could actually say.
MHM.
So that means, PEOP, so people experience that they are also satisfied with these small things, the small successes in everyday life. And because of that, they naturally become a bit, composed is right, but it's also, I'm thinking right now about the systemic value level, so that means they can more easily let things slide. They can also, handle a setback a bit better, so to speak.
Yes.
Well.
Endure it.
So, cope well, endure it, and adapt accordingly. Also to learn something new again. So I think that's, important. But what science also says is that people become less flexible as they age. That means the big changes are often very, very exhausting for older people. And they tend to struggle with that, so to speak. And, there's basically a loss of flexibility that was often present in people before,
Yes, in terms of the trend, It's naturally also. Exactly as you say, but then you get to know very different ones too, like you said at the beginning, right? I recently did a profiling with a woman over 80 as well. And she was just so open and wonderful, that woman. And sometimes I get the impression that I have 25-year-olds who already have a crust of concrete on their heads. But the general trend is true, of course. And like you said in one of our last conversations, you also mentioned that when you enter the third stage of life, this cosmos of professional relationships often just falls away. And that's why it's also important, I think, to prepare. You know. So the 4 areas of life, the main areas I always cite, right? We have partnership and family, we have work, we have social integration, friends and acquaintances, and we have hobbies and special interests. And if, in your working life, this work area has sort of nibbled away at everything else, so to speak, then of course a huge amount falls away and you're not really prepared. Right. And then of course there's the fact that you need to have enough relationships, because as you also said, well, sure, the loss of people in old age is inevitable. And in that sense, I believe you can't really have enough. Establish, have, and nurture enough good relationships to get through that time well.
MHM. Exactly. What also plays a role, inspired by what you just said, is of course that because work falls away, that people should look for a different framework of meaning. Right. And that's where the aspect of generativity plays a big role, which Erik Erikson coined in his developmental psychology. And Pasqualina Pariciello, a Swiss researcher on aging, then took it up and researched it thoroughly. So it's extremely important to ask yourself, how can I use my gifts, talents, and abilities for the generations, so to speak, that come after me? And it's not about some grand gesture at all. Like that you get heavily involved in politics now, let's say, and take on a political office, but it's also about the small everyday things where I make a contribution that ultimately benefits the people after me in some way. And many people find meaning in that too, because of course it often has something to do with other people. And then they can link up and connect with other people again. And that's where